Welcome to another episode of the podcast. We're back with the old format because I'm doing a new type of show only in Italian, but we're back today with an episode that we promised we'd have made a few years ago when we did our show on origins of religion. So now, 3 years later, we are back for part 2 of that. And maybe even something more, because it's gonna be, if you thought that the first part was difficult, this is probably gonna be even more difficult. But it comes with the territory. It's a complex topic. We are getting into the advanced material here. And I am here once again, of course, with Douglas Martin. So, Douglas, welcome back, and thank you for being here for part 2.
It's really great to be back on here with you, Francesco. It's been a while, yes, indeed. Always a pleasure, and really happy to be here. And we've got a lot to discuss, so I'm really looking forward to today's show, and hopefully we can bring some clarity to these difficult subjects.
Yes, we've covered quite a few things on part 1, ranging from salvation myth to the building of the pyramids, to the orientation and how we need to stay oriented when dealing with the subjects. We talked about the stellar cult, lunar cult, and solar cult, and how those have changed during the various epochs. So annual cycles and stellar cycles. So that was quite a lot in there. I actually think that we did a good job on that show explaining all that, and today I think we're getting into even more of that. So yeah, I think we can start getting into it. I don't know where you wanted to start.
One of the things I want to make sure and say is that Nate Cap over at the Cubbyhole has done a fantastic job laying a lot of foundations and advanced subject matter and bringing a lot of clarity to these difficult subjects. He and I have, had the pleasure or the gift of having a relationship and working on these subjects together. And we've kind of had the Indiana Jones and Son relationship dealing with some of these difficult subjects. And he's done a really fantastic job laying down a lot of great foundations. And of course, Brandon Martin also has done fantastic work and dealing with these more advanced topics. And, their work is, it's impeccable, and it's genuine scholarship and a lot of hard-won knowledge. So I really appreciate their efforts. And then you yourself, I've been keeping up with your work, and it's amazing. And I totally respect your decision to take your show back to the Italian format, and I understand that. So it's a lot of reading for me, but I try to keep, aloof of the subject and the material, subject matter and the material that you're dealing with. And we've all got some big pieces of the puzzle to bring to the table. As far as today's show, I really want to start out with the foundation of origin of religion. So I think it's good to point out that religion is a highly ambiguous term that's largely misunderstood. So I want to establish this foundation that the whole idea of religion is, in the first place, is the rejection of man's law or man's authority. And with that is a prospect for higher learning. So, with the rejection of man's law, which leads to man's arbitration of truth, we have to understand that genuine truth, which unfolds the true whole science, becomes an inconvenient truth when humanity slides into socialism and material prospect. So the material prospect, hypothetically, is a propensity for man to stray from truth. So the spiritual life isn't, there's so much confusion about a spiritual prospect. Most people associate it with a prospect for the afterlife. And that's incorrect. Because in the afterlife, you're not going to be able to affect change in the real world. So the spiritual prospect is concerning what's happening in this lifetime. And this is why the idea of the spiritual birth or the second birth has to occur within the span of a mortal life. And, it's a big subject, and we're kind of diving in head first. So, without going too far ahead, kind of hover around this general problem here for a little bit, because I'll say it again. The original prospect for religion is a rejection of man's law or man's authority. So therefore, it is a prospect for higher learning. And the entire unfoldment of our knowledge, of true knowledge and the true science, it's done so with great care and great concern for each new phase of its unfoldment, because the ancients are understanding very well the dangers that lie ahead. They understand that man is potentially responsible for all coming evil. So in order, or as a contingency to keep our course true, explains a lot about what's happening in the early ancient world. And we're talking about an antiquity that most people don't really understand. It's very ancient. So chronologically, it would be good to kind of outline what kind of time period we're talking about, which most people don't really have a concept of. I mean, quite frankly, I see most people within the confines of a 3,000-year box. And if they've done, a little bit of work, maybe they're emerging out into a 6,000-year box. And, in scholarship, maybe in academia, maybe a 12,000-year box. See, because what I'm trying to say is those would all be very, very late in the game. All of these time periods are not only very late in the game, but they're already posterior to the corruption of solar doctrines. And we have a lot of writers on the subject for Osiris doctrines, for instance. And they really aren't really making a lot of progress with that. And there's a reason for that, because the Osiris doctrines are the pinnacle of the unfoldment of Egyptian mythos. So it is the apex of the entire unfoldment. And then the eschatology. So, this really took place about 40,000 years ago, where the solar began to really become ambiguous and corrupted and stagnate. But in Egypt, nothing was really ever lost. It's more of a case of the changing of types. And as a result, it created ambiguity. And then the ambiguity largely misinterpreted. So we have to understand that most of the unfoldment and the early phases of the unfoldment predate language, and that the astronomy is very, very ancient. And in early astronomy, it's not done with mathematical calculations. It's done by observance over long periods of time before mathematics is developed enough to make mathematical calculations. But by the time they actually built the pyramids, they do have the mathematical calculations. But see, it starts long before that. So essentially, I'm saying that the solar cult has been in existence for 100,000 years, and that the lunar cult preceded that lasted for 50,000 years, and that the stellar cult, it lasted at least 300 to 600,000 years. And that creates a lot of ambiguity. And these are huge timelines, which leaves a lot of ambiguity. And people obviously don't really understand how to understand it. The way we really need to learn to understand it is by trying to understand the culture. And then by understanding the culture, we can understand what they're endeavoring to do. And then only then can we really understand the artifacts and the ruins and the remains of these civilization. We're digging in the strata. We're not really going to understand what we're finding unless we understand what they're endeavoring to do and why. So this is a big part of the problem. This is a big part of the confusion. But back to the original statement that religion begins with the rejection of man's prospect for authority, or man's claim to the Most High, or man as the arbiter of law. So therefore is a prospect for higher learning. That's one of the most important things I want to be able to drive home today. Because when we're talking about religion, a lot of people they condemn religion as a form of mind control. And a lot of people's ambition is to destroy all the creed because of the hatred and the confusion. It does seem like a lot of the religion, especially institutionalized religion, is doing more harm than good, which in many ways it is. So it's probably pretty important to establish that most people think that the world is controlled through Washington, D.C., London, and Moscow. But the fact of the matter is the world is controlled through Rome, Mecca, and Israel. And these represent remnants of the old Egyptian cults, with Rome being the solar, pure solar. And that's what Christianity is. It's a solar doctrine because it's based on the cosmic cycle of the sun. And then Islam in Mecca is a remnant of lunar. However, it's a solarized lunar because we're in this solar cult. So you could say it's a remnant of lunar cult, but it's a solarized remnant of a lunar cult. And then with Israel is a remnant of stellar, also solarized. And all these religions come from Hebrew doctrine, which is Abrahamic doctrine, which is in fact a solar doctrine. And it's an ancient solar doctrine, but it's already corrupted. It's already corrupted in Babylon before Abrahamic doctrines are brought forth. So the Hebrews took from the Babylonians what was already a corrupted Egyptian, and the Greeks took from the Hebrews, and the Romans took from the Greeks what was already a corrupted Egyptian, and that's been perpetuated into the modern world by scholarship. So the dilemma is pretty vast and pretty large, and the corruption. I mean, right now I see humanity on the opposite side of the universe going in the wrong direction from truth. So we're not just off course, we're way off course. And we've only got a finite amount of time to get this figured out before this colossal ignorance, which is the true adversary, will destroy us in man's ambition for material prospect. So when we put the material prospect, which is not fully understood, the idea of materials, and we want to talk about that a little bit. But we're putting the square on top of the triangle. And we need to restore the triangle on top of the square, which is the spiritual prospect over the physical prospect. So as you can see, we're already getting in really deep. But I just want to kind of make sure that this chronology that I've laid out is somewhat understood, so we can really start to get our head around how much time we're dealing with and how to understand the changes in the culture according to the unfoldment of the mythos. Because the more we can understand it, the more we can isolate it in the early phase of the stellar cult and leading up to where the pyramids were built. Because, a big part of the question is we want to understand how much do they understand what will succeed the stellar phase. And the more I've studied it, the more it's revealed to me that they do understand the danger of venerating in annual cycles, number one, which it begins in the lunar phase. So in that way, the beginning of the lunar phase is it is the beginning of the solar phase in a sense, because we're venerating in annual cycles. So the lunar preceding the solar is deliberate. And this is how we understand that the stellar people knew this. They understood what was to come, but it's not prophetic. It's about understanding what what the dangers that lie ahead are potentially, which venerating in annual cycles, it's very dangerous for a couple of big reasons. Number one, it has the potential to break their timekeeping chronology, which is in the stellar cult, they're keeping time in the great year cycle of the circumpolar constellations, the movement of the circumpolar constellations, the 7 stars in the north that shift the pole star at the station over the 25,827 year cycle, which is roughly 26,000 years, so roughly 3,600 years for each pole star. And whatever pole star moves into primacy is still recognized as Polaris, but is actually a pole star from a different constellation. And that gets very difficult. So the astronomy is very ancient, and the unfoldment of the mythos is it begins at a very remote period of antiquity. So all of these tiny boxes of perception, in most cases, is very late in the game. So as long as we're stuck in those small boxes, we're not really going to be able to make much progress. And this is, the result of this is viewing what we find in the Egyptian pantheon as forms of polytheism, which is a fallacy, quite frankly. So in order to really help people grasp what we're talking about, it really needs to be understood from the earliest stages of the unfoldment, up to the building of the pyramids, and then the shift into the lunar phase of the mythos, and then ultimately following the lunar, we begin the solar phase. So the lunar phase lasts 50,000 years. And the best I can tell, that's deliberate. And that each succeeding cult of the solar phase, they have significant differences. So when we're talking about the stellar phase, we need to be able to distinguish the early stellar phase from the middle stellar phase from the late stellar phase. So in the stellar phase, it begins in the south. And in the middle, we're dealing with double equinox, double horizon. So at the equator, if you will. And we have to understand that only in Egypt does the atmosphere provide a clear enough view of the cosmos for the mapping of the stars in the early astronomy to have taken place. So when we find it in other regions of the world, we need to be able to recognize, for instance, when we find the 3 circles at Cornwall in England, that this was brought there from Egypt, because only in Egypt would they have the ability to map the southern, the equator, and the northern skies. And we need to recognize that only in Egypt does the atmosphere provide a clear enough view of the skies in order to really map out the heavens, or the cosmology, or the astronomy. That's important. And I could probably say it a little bit better. It could only be in a climate like Egypt that this could be done, where the atmosphere was clear and no clouds to obscure their perpetual view and unceasing watchings of all the stars shone with that brilliancy we find there. What other country on earth has this same atmospheric surroundings? So that's the part of the point I'm trying to make. And I'm going to do a little bit of reading today. And I've got, some books here in reach that we're going to need and try to refer to those. But let me keep going here for a minute. The whole mystery is only going to be unraveled in the study of Egypt. It's in Egypt where we're going to find the answers to these larger questions. The Greek mythology, for instance, will not unravel by studying it in the dress of the Celtic or in the dress of the Mexican. It has to be studied in the dress of the Egyptian, and that holds true for all other traditions that we find throughout the world until it's studied in the Egyptian dress. It's not going to fully unravel. And go ahead and let me veg on this for a minute, and we'll try to take it a little farther.
Yeah, I was wondering about. Yeah, you were talking about the fact that these stellar people sort of knew that the culture and the veneration were shifting towards venerating into annual cycles, and they took contingency measures for it. So you were saying an important thing, that it was not about being prophetic, but having the rather having the long view of what was about to of I guess history, or how the culture was going to change. That obviously require
Right.
a long view, and a long view of history and society and culture. It's not very easy for us to understand this because we have a different mindset today, and I think we might run the risk of probably make probably people would think that that they had some sort of special ability or magic power, or or that it could be misconstrued. The whole thing could be misconstrued as believing that sort of that it was an ancient golden age, or a past golden age where everything was done right, and they understood things, and it can be. I mean, my point is that we're not really able to understand this long view of of history, and this pattern recognition. I think I can say.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Yeah, people don't generally, even in academia, they don't have a good understanding of culture. So, in order to get a good understanding of culture, we need to understand what they care about, and therefore we can start to understand what they're endeavoring to do and why.
Yeah. So sorry, but yeah, I guess one of the other things I was trying to say was that endeavoring to unravel all this past history or ancient history, might lead people to think that it's another search for an ancient golden age that we can't grasp now, and these people knew everything that was going to happen in the future, and try to warn us, and So they were, as you said, can be misconstrued as prophetic, etc. So
That's right.
I think that's one thing that we need to
Yeah, I'll address that
explain,
now.
because we're not really saying that it was something mystical and mythical.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's an unfoldment of a true science, and it's unfolded with great care and great concern. So a lot of what's taking place in antiquity is a contingency for the next phase. So once we get to the solar cult, the initial onset of the solar cult, which succeeds the lunar, is the cult of the Sphinx, and it lasts 12,000 years. And that's an indication, because all solar doctrines are based on the 12, which is significant because it typifies the greater mysteries, which are originally 10, then extended to 12. So everything in the solar doctrines are largely dealing with the 12, whereas in the stellar doctrines, you're dealing with the 7. And we're going to make a lot of hard points about that, because ideally, we're going to need to learn to understand Amenta in the West, which happens in the solar phase, before we can fully appreciate the unfoldment of Amenta originally in the North in the stellar phase. So that's a very advanced statement, but I want to try to help bring some clarity to that the 7 is carrying the 5 and preparing the way for the 5. But yeah, this idea that there was a golden age, I mean, most people's idea about antiquity is very, very misconstrued and very misgiven. They don't really have a real perspective, and quite frankly, most people really don't understand how to deal with time itself. So it's probably a good idea to say here that part of this corruption of this Egyptian science is a result of man's ambition to put a finer point on time. And specifically for means of agriculture, but also as a means of claim to the Most High. So the phenomenon of the error in time under Gregory the 13th in the 16th century is when the largest part of the world population was forced onto the Gregorian calendar and the mechanical clock. So we need to understand how the modern Gregorian calendar and the mechanical clock is actually driving human behavior. Because at the end of the day, everything we're talking about, we're trying to get down to what is driving human behavior. That's what this is really all about. But most people's ideas about antiquity are very confused, and they have these ideas of this pre-existing golden age, as they call it. And I want to point out that is based on the idea that we're trapped in cosmic cycles of time. And I want to clear that up and make the statement that is not the case. It's about consciousness, and our free will determines, what we're going to put our focus on and affect change in the world, not cosmic cycles of time. Now, cosmic cycles of time do have the influence, but that's only because we're ignorant of it, or we're allowing it to control our mind by giving over our power to an authority. So this idea of the golden age, ancient civilization is not what people think, but see, most people are completely oblivious to the idea of the stellar cult. They don't know what that is. So the best ideas that they have about that are some, golden age civilization, Atlantis, Lemuria, all this dogma that is a result of not fully understanding the ancient world and what the learned men of antiquity actually understand and are endeavoring to preserve and perpetuate into modernity, but ultimately results in a failure in the priest class during the cult. Really takes place in the solar cult posterior to the perfected eschatology, which is the cult of Osiris. And then it begins to diminish. And a lot of the reason for that is because the advancements in the solar phase involved a lot of changing of previous types. And then ultimately anthropomorphizing deities, which represent elemental powers. So the anthropomorphization of the elemental powers leads to characterization of deities, and then the characterization of deities, which are simply aspects of elemental powers, become confused and then misunderstood as polytheism, for instance. So
Yeah, there's also the starting to attributing to those elemental powers, attributes like actually good and evil, for instance, the first one. So then
that's right.
you get the evil deities that cause a lot of that then they get propagated into the future, then create lots of confusion.
Right, and this happens in Babylon. The so-called Anunnaki.
Yeah,
In Babylon were actually the Egyptian 7 elemental powers, and then the Egyptian elemental powers were misconstrued in Babylon evil spirits originally. But see, elemental powers can neither be good nor bad, good nor evil, because elemental powers are not moral or immoral.
because we're
They're
basically
elemental
giving human,
powers.
we're giving human
That
attributes to these natural forces.
these are natural forces in nature. So, for example, an elemental power is storm. But if we start to break down the aspects of storm, then some of these storm are beneficial, such as rain. Without rain, we'll have drought. So that's a beneficial, positive aspect of elemental powers in storm. But destructive aspects of elemental powers in storm, for instance, hurricane, lightning, tornado, hail, or flooding, or just torrential rain, obviously those things can do damage. But the arid winds of the north, is where we get the idea of the fire drake, which is the breath of the dragon. It's an expression that predates language of elemental powers. So this is part of what all the confusion. But as I said, the more we look at the chronology of the Egyptian cults, it seems to indicate that this was all understood before it actually took place. The idea is that the pyramids are built at the end of the stellar cult, which is the contingency for beginning lunar cult, because we're going to venerate cycles. So we have to understand that the fact that they, in the stellar phase, they only venerated in the heliacal rising of the star Sirius because it's a fertility prospect, number one. We need to understand. So fertility is a big subject, and we want to explain that a little bit. But the fertility represents the success of the hero in the hero myth. So the beginning of the stellar cult is the beginning of the early hero myth, the Heru, Heru, and Horus being the primary hero of the hero myth, which is in fact simply another aspect of the original primary deity, which is Sut, because it starts in the south. So when it starts in the south and then moves into the north, Horus is designated as god of the North Pole, but that's misconstrued as the god of the North Pole deposing the god of the South Pole. So then you get this adversarial conflict between forces of light and forces of darkness. So we have to understand that the night sky and the darkness is associated with the feminine and the spiritual realm. So Sut is original primary deity, and Horus, as god of the North Pole, is simply another aspect of the same. And that's very hard to understand. But once we get to the solar cult, it begins with the cult of the Sphinx in 12,000 years, in my view, as an indication that you're in greater mysteries. So the failure in the priest class that takes place is a result not just of deliberate ambition for material prospect and socialism. It's a result of neglect to adhere to pure forms. So the pure forms, they come from all three phases of the unfoldment in the stellar cult, which is a contingency for what's going to happen in the solar and lunar phase. Because you're going to venerate in your annual cycles, and the anthropomorphization is going to become a reality. And so everything up to that point, there is no anthropomorphization in the stellar mythos.
Yeah.
So they're venerating in the heliacal rising of the star Sirius, because that corresponds to the inundation, which is the Nile overflowing its banks and fertilizing the soil with the fluvian rich soils for the next planting season. So in that way, it symbolizes fertility. One of the most beautiful ideas of the Egyptians was that of representing the eternal Father by the ever-coming Son, as in the child Horus, who was the type of eternal youth as an external child. This was the child of a mother who was the eternal virgin, and thus youth or youthfulness had been imaged by the pre-anthropomorphic types of the calf, the lamb, the branch of a tree, and the shoot of a papyrus plant. The doctrines of the incarnation, the virgin birth, the resurrection, the Father God who is identical with his own Son, and others believed to be specifically Christian, were Egyptian ages and ages before the present era began. And that's exactly what I'm trying to say here. So the cult of Ptah lasts 20,000 years. And it's dealing with the 9, because the 9 is the contingency for double digits. Because as I said, the greater mysteries arrive in 10. But see, the 12, we're trying to understand how much the stellar really understood the 12 in the stellar cult. But in my research, I would say it was fully understood. But we still have to deal with the fact that the greater mysteries arrive in 10, and that the Ta is the 9, which is a contingency. It's also a symbol of completion in the stellar cult, but it's also a symbol of the onset of the solar cult. And the cult of Ta lasts 20,000 years, succeeded by the cult of Amen-Ra, which is a major shift because it goes from night sky veneration into day sky veneration. So in day sky veneration, the entire night sky where all the cosmology was written is completely blighted out and dominated by a single celestial body, which is the sun. So the day sky prospect is it symbolizes a physical prospect, and it's masculine. This is what everything they're doing is a contingency for this danger. So the cult of Amen-Ra was in years succeeded by the cult of Osiris. And at that stage where the eschatology is perfected, that is the pinnacle of the unfoldment of the Egyptian mythos. However, it's succeeded by a slide into socialism and dogma. So that is the real problem that humanity is faced with. And it's a result of man's ambition to put a finer point on time, but straying from source, which is pure forms, stellar cult, and neglect to adhere to pure forms. So I know most people don't really understand that. In regard to the inundation, to me, the fact that they venerated annual cycles in the heliacal rising of Sirius corresponding with the inundation is very significant. Number one, because it helps us understand that the hero cult is about a prospect for fertility. And then number two, to me, it's that they not only do not venerate in annual cosmic cycles of the sun and the moon, but they deliberately do not venerate because they understand the danger. So the whole idea is they're going to build the pyramids before they venerate in annual cycles as a contingency for that danger. So we have to understand that being time in the great year cycle of the circumpolar constellations in the north, the shifting of the 7 stations of the pole, and that's a 26,000 year period. So they're able to document and log long epochs of time. When we venerate in annual cycles, there's a danger that chronology would be broken, and that's exactly what's happened. So to me, the fact that they did not venerate in annual cycles in the early mythos is a deliberate convention because it's a contingency. And that's very advanced, but
yeah, so it's a deliberate
yep.
act to try to preserve the pure forms and the
Yes,
and source source knowledge
and chronology.
Mm.
And the epochs that have already been recorded, which are 26,000 years roughly. So we have to understand that the precession of the equinoxes is really a recession because that's taking place in the zodiac in the solar phase. So it moves backward through the zodiac in the great year. But in the annual year, it moves clockwise in the zodiac. This is part of what it's about. So we can identify. So we need to understand that Pisces and Virgo are significant signs in the zodiac because they represent the equinoxes, that spring and autumn equinox. So these can be discovered by equal day, equal night. But in the great year cycle, they can only be discovered by understanding the herald star, which is the presiding star in the east at spring equinox. So what house that it resides in at the spring equinox, that's much more difficult. So the idea is that this knowledge has to be passed forth to progeny and posterity in order to preserve it and maintain the chronology and maintain the positions of the cosmos. It's very advanced. But the great year also, prior to the solar doctrine and the solar phase, is preserved in the shifting of the 7 stations of the pole. It's the same 25,000 year, 25,827 year cycle, but its intervals are the shifting of the poles at the station rather than the movement of the house backward through the zodiac. So as you can see, it's very perplexing. But let's go back to the stellar cult. Also, the symbol of Horus in the stellar phase is typified by fish, which is Sebek Horus. So one thing that we want to establish with this is the source of the original salvation myth. Because the original salvation myth is not about the return of the sun. It's about the return of the inundation, which is typified by the fish. And that's Sebek Horus, later changed to alligator. And then now we see it as the Pope's mitre. So obviously modern religious institutions recognize the importance of fish symbolism, but they don't really understand what its significance is, or they don't want the populations to understand it because that is the source of their materialistic power. Okay. They are preserving Sebek in the mitre. Understand, because we're talking about a failure in the priest class. So it's really never about it's about what and why. You know, that's our responsibility as a species. You know, if somebody else has our best interest in mind and we're willing to tell us as gospel, then I think we pretty much deserve what we're going to get. We have to step into the role of taking responsibility for truth, or somebody else is going to be more than happy to arbitrate it for us. And that will sow the seeds of our own destruction as a species, because man is fallible. So in order to God's cosmic, we can call natural law, then we have to dethrone man as a claim to be the lawmaker. And we have to be able to show that God's law is supreme. And that's what this unfoldment of this true science is. It's the testimony that man's law is fallible. It's not just. It's arbitrary. And that the true science is an inconvenient truth for man's institution. Because man's institution is a claim to the Most High. So as Nate was saying in his new show, the devil is the illusion. And that illusion is that man can set up as the lawmaker. So anybody that supports that is on the side of the devil in the sense of the illusion. You're living, and our chains are set lightly upon us. but we need only find that care in ourselves for truth, to uphold truth, and find our way back to pure forms. And our responsibility from there is to adherence to pure forms, because that is the metric of where man has the potential to get to riches. And with all this modern technology, we're already there. So we don't have all the time in the world to accomplish this. And we've already lost a significant amount of time. It may already be too late. It's not really for anybody to say, but I would say as long as anybody can really, find their way back to pure forms, it's still possible. So my work and the gift for that work is proving to myself and no one else that it can be done. Whether or not anybody understands anything I'm saying is their problem. It's not my problem. I already understand it. And that doesn't mean I know all there is to know. It means I know enough about what matters, true value in this world. And I know how to rediscover the unfoldment and trace my way back and go to and fro, back again to pure forms. And I understand why. Because it's all psychology. What's driving human behavior? Well, right now, what's driving mass confusion? And the only way to eliminate that mass confusion is to understand what has true value in this world and restore that, adhere to that. But or we grasp for the higher rungs of the ladder and try to wield forces in nature and with full spectrum dominance over elemental powers, which is already happening, and it's terrifying. So yeah, go ahead. I mean, we're getting into some deep stuff here.
Yeah, lots of things. There will be lots of things we could get on from this, but I think it's important to maybe to let people try to understand what we're saying regarding the connection between strain from source and getting into under slavery, basically, and becoming completely enslaved.
And that's what it is. It's slavery.
Yeah.
Man's law is slavery, and we need to understand that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think we need to consider that when we, the strain from source is it derived from what it was in a way an evolution, but it was driven by maybe more practical purposes, which wasn't bad in and of itself. However, then the practical purpose took precedence, over the knowledge that from which it was coming from.
The truth.
Yeah. So basically, we have now the utilitarian.
That's right. I don't mean to interrupt you. Yeah, you're spot on.
Yeah. So the utilitarianism gets on top of truth.
Right. We're putting the triangle, or putting the triangle below the square.
Yeah, getting something done. We do it not considering anything else or what the consequences might be, or what's going to happen to to people, for instance. So it's the triumph of utilitarianism
for virtue. This is what I call Roman. Of course, it exists before Rome. It starts, essentially in Babylon, but Roman pragmatism, because in Rome we have historical examples of a disregard for morality and virtue. And, in the Machiavellianism, the virtue is redefined by that which leads to a stronger state.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is materialism, and it's driven by utilitarianism. So to fully understand that, we have to understand that man's natural habitat is very close, 5 degrees north or south of the equator. So the farther we stray from the natural habitat, the more we become dependent on utility. But then utility leads to an ambition for power or greed through agriculture and other means, technology. But greed and avarice take precedence over man's
Morals.
responsibility to truth and
Oh, yeah,
morals.
yeah.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah. You know, this idea that a modern religion is meant to confuse morality is a fallacy. It's not meant to confuse reality. It's in a vestigial form. So if the religion is not posing a resistance to the state and man setting up as the lawmaker, it's already vestigial. And once it becomes vestigial, if it's anthropomorphized, which it likely is, it's already dogmatic. But if it's not posing a resistance to the state and to the Most High, then the religion itself has already lost its potency. So it is inert. Yeah, we'll go ahead and do a little bit of reading now.
Sure.
Because we've already made this point. So, in the words of Albert Churchward, in the stellar mythos, we find the culti, quote unquote, KHUTI, or quote, glorious ones, end quote, succeeding the elemental powers. With Horus as the eighth and supreme. And these the Babylonians converted into evil spirits, not understanding or having forgotten the original, the old Egyptian wisdom. And comparing the Egyptian mythology with the Babylonian, the types that represent evil in the latter had represented good in the former. The old great mother of evil, called the dragon horse in the Assyrian version, was neither the source nor the product of evil in the original. The serpent goddess Renut, Rannut, as renewer of the fruits of the earth in the soil or on the tree, is not a representation of evil. The types of good and ill were indiscriminately mixed, preeminently so in the reproduction of the old great mother as Tiamat. Originally, she was a form of the mother earth, Tu'art, Ta'urt, T-A-U-R-T, Ta'urt, of the Egyptians. The great mother, variously named Tiamat, Zakum, Nen, Kigal, or Nana, was not originally evil. She represented source in perfect correspondence to Ta'urt, Apt, and Renut, or Renut of Egypt. Howsoever hideous, was not bad or inimical to man, the mother and nurse of all, the mother of gods and men, who was the renewer and bringer forth of life in earth and water. Likewise, in Egypt, the 7 Anunnaki were spirits of earth, born of the earth mother. In the earth, they were not wicked spirits. The elements are not immoral. So it's saying what I had just said, that elemental powers were construed by the Babylonians with evil spirits, and then later misconstrued as interdimensional entities. And this is where we get terms like Lemuria and dogma, such as interference theory and alien intervention. The idea that the human species had been re-engineered as genetically as a slave species. This is dogmatic, and it's probably more dangerous than even Abraham doctrines. So you need to be very careful with this dogma and understand where it comes from. So in dealing with the Egyptian, we can understand the complexity, which is the result, or, resulting in the perplexity and the stultification of modern man. So we have to understand that a lot of these things predate language. The original forms and types are not anthropomorphic and do predate language. So we have to understand the danger of anthropomorphization is about adding human characteristics to elemental powers and then distinguishing the quote unquote gods with human characters or divinities and assigning human qualities to these is a very dangerous prospect. So Ta, at the beginning of the solar cult, is a contingency for this phenomenon, which is a phenomenon of the solar cult, because this is where the anthropomorphization begins. It's very difficult to understand. It's very difficult to explain, but this is the case. So you could literally say the pyramids were built as a contingency for the anthropomorphic phase. That would be accurate. But that's not all that it is. It's a contingency to adhere and preserve pure forms. So first they venerate in symbol, which is gavel. And that's 3 sticks crossed, which gives us the 7 points. But the gavel is carrying the X on the axis, which carries the 5. So the 5 is advanced because it's a prospect for the eschatology, which hasn't been fully developed yet. And we're talking in the early stellar cult. So in the early stellar cult, it starts in the south. And then in the middle stellar cult, we have Horus of the double horizon. So what is preserved in Acts is gavel. And the axis of the gavel is the vertical stem, which is carrying the axe. But the axe is the prospect for the full development of the eschatology, which doesn't happen until, epochs later in the stellar cult, which we can call Osiris. But see, this is understood in the stellar cult. So it's originally the gods of the 4 corners, which represents the physical realm, with spirit at the center dot in the square. That's pure animism. So the fact that the spiritual realm is happening and taking place at the same time, in the same place as the physical realm, this is what animism is concerning, that everything has the spirit at the center. And that the 4 is always a prospect for the physical. So the divine prospect is always denoted by the odd numbers. So when we're trying to understand the mysteries, we want to understand the odd numbers. And we should always look at the even numbers as a transition. However, we need to understand that the 2 and the 4 exclusively typify a physical prospect. So one of the things that's significant about the numbers is they are perpetual and they are unambiguous. So they do preserve pure forms. So we have to be, when we're dealing with the mysteries, we really have to understand the numerology, because people's idea about gematria is inert and vestigial and ambiguous because they don't understand pure forms. So we have to understand that the original lesser mysteries are 7, which is a prospect for the 8, which is pure spirit. And the 8 represents the 1 because it's commencement and recommencement of a cycle in that sense. It's Alpha and Omega. So the idea is that what's below our feet is the lowest plane. And then what's at the highest apex of creation is pure spirit. So in the physical world, it is duality. And in the spiritual realm above, at the highest, is singularity. But what's going on between our ears, our psyche, is that middle ground. But it's inherently born ignorant. It has to raise out of the mire of the ignorance. So that place between the lowest low and the highest high is our raising in the mortal life and attaining to this higher spiritual prospect, what we can call Ra, or the risen Horus in Amsu. It's a prospect for right action in the sense that we can't accidentally do the right thing. We have to know right from wrong, and then ultimately be serving a divine prospect or a higher purpose. So it's very difficult to explain, but main point I was trying to make is it is our mental faculty that constitutes the highest that we can raise in the physical life. And that's represented by Mercury in the solar doctrine. But that's even more ancient than solar, but it would be Mercury in the solar doctrine, for example, because that's the closest to the light. So it's the messenger, it's the quicksilver. And most people, a lot of people, in the occult research, they do understand cult of the black sun. But what that ultimately really is a corrupted solar cult. Because solar doctrines and all of the Egyptian doctrines have a profound impact on human drive. And therefore, we are dealing with psychology. So modern, which should be placed at the apex of the pyramid or the hierarchy of science, but we don't have ancient psychology in modern scholarship and academia. We have what I would call psychology in its infancy. So the story of Jung and Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud is pretty important to understand. One of the things that we need to understand about it is that their falling out happened basically in the immediate wake of his publication of the psychology of the unconscious, or the psychology of the subconscious, which was in 1912. And then right on the heels of that starts World War I. That's very important, I think, to understand. But that the original rift between Jung and Freud was about how we define the term libido, which is what drives human behavior. So in the Freudian all drives are of a sexual nature. This is where we get ideas like the Oedipus complex and such, but obviously it's older because that comes from Greek mythology. But I think that the Freudian ideals did a lot of damage, maybe possibly even more damage than Christianity in the 20th century to the human psyche. But the Freudian would define libido as of a sexual drive of a sexual nature, whereas the Jungian, the libido would be determined by which stage of human development that the individual was in, from infancy into maturity, which could be 3 or 4 stages. In 3 stages, it would be infancy, and then growth, and then maturity, which would be basically typified by puberty. But it could be 4 stages, post-adolescence. But either way, the libido was defined by what stage of human development we were in. Now that's basically what that was about. But there's a lot more to it. But see, I'm basically making the statement that modern psychology is psychology in its infancy, and the whole science, everything in the early Egyptian was part of a whole science. So it was astronomy, it was all of our sciences in one. It's all self-contained, but it's a higher prospect than utility or materialism. So therefore, it is a prospect for higher learning. And it's a difficult subject. But this ancient psychology is very critical to being able to really understand and unfold the Egyptian mythos and retrace it back to its source. Because it is, part of understanding natural law and how karma actually, takes place. Most people have a misconstrued idea about karma. They think that it means that every time you do something wrong, you're going to walk outside and an anvil is going to fall on your head, or you're going to get instant karma. No. Karma is visited on the children. Karma is visited on progeny and posterity, which means that the world's going to become less free in this slide into socialism and materialism and prospect for utility and this Roman pragmatism. It is posterity that will pay the ultimate price for that. So, if we genuinely love our children and we genuinely care about the future of humanity, then we want to leave the world in a better condition that we found it, which we would never be able to achieve with the material prospect. So
you only live once.
Everything the ancient
prospect.
Right, that's atheistic in the sense of the one shot and out. It's typical of a left brain imbalance in the sense of random theory. A lot of people don't really understand natural law, I think, because they don't understand worldview schism.
Yeah, and then we don't care.
The random.
There is the idea of not caring for future
right.
generations.
They're looking for every excuse.
What's going to happen to the future generations.
Right. And they could give less than 2 shits about it.
Oh, yes, basically.
But at the same time, they'll tell you, they'll tell their children that they love them, and it's just, easier said than done.
Yeah.
But,
and that's one of
very astute.
Yeah. That's one of the things that sets our culture aside from maybe others or from the past the element of care. Like, you see how much, some cultures cared in such a way that they built pretty much what they considered indestructible monuments as testimony leave us some of the, to leave some of their understandings and knowledge for the future. So that's something we can hardly grasp today.
Right. To build monuments like that in the modern world, they want to tell you it's impossible, but it's completely unfeasible is a better word, because their primary ambition is materialism. So it's not cost effective, or it's unfeasible. But
again, not to say that
we have to
that was a magical golden age or anything like that. So
I just remember the idea of a golden age is that we're trapped in cosmic cycles, and then it's going to revolve around again. That's not how it works. So yeah, karma is visited on the children, and they will inherit our benevolence or our malevolence, and the result of that. So, the law of freedom: as morality declines, freedom declines. That's really what we're faced with. So our responsibility is to truth. Know the truth, and the truth will set you free. But what is this truth? We're talking about the real human story, which is a much larger period of time than most people can get their head around, because most people don't even understand time in a very basic way. They want to convince themselves they do, and I'm telling you, they don't. It takes a lot of work and a lot of effort. But don't think of it as work. The whole point is just to enjoy yourself. But we genuinely are trying to recover what was humanity's greatest achievement, because we're talking about a body of science that took the longest period of time to develop and understand, and it happened over the course of hundreds of thousands of years. We're not going to do better than that in a single lifetime. That's the hubris of modern man. This is the hubris of modern psychology. It's related to humanism and the Greek ideal, that human problems can be solved with human ideas. And in the Greek humanism, it's basically a shift away from, reliance on the gods. So less reliance on the rapid, in quotes, gods. But as I said, the Greeks never understood the Egyptian. So they never really had access to source knowledge, in a sense, of pure forms. But I'm a little bit all over the place here. I'm trying to get us back on track with the Egyptian.
Yeah, can I maybe ask you a question?
Sure.
So, how come if people in classical history didn't understand what the Egyptians were trying to do? How can we understand it, basically?
Okay, I know how to answer this. Okay, first of all, as I said before, what we're dealing with is a failure in the priest class. And this happened in the solar phase. So modern scholarship, in the sense, is not able to contend with that. And it's largely because it's already corrupted in the sense of a material prospect. So the result of that is, scholarship is tenured in its own bullshit. It's tenured in its own dogma, and it's tenured in its own ignorance. So we have to remember, ignorance is the adversary. And what is that ignorance concerning? Well, it's not, ignorance of the latest, greatest meatloaf recipe, but it is ignorance of things that matter the most, which I would tell you is the unfoldment of the true science, which only happened in Egypt. So in order for us to really what we have to do, we have to recognize that we have to exceed academia. And that sounds like a lofty task. How do we do that? I'll tell you how we do it. We reject socialism, which is man's law. Because as long as we're embracing the prospect for man as the authority and man as the lawmaker, then we are inevitably trapped in socialism. And the dogma and the failure in scholarship and academia is only going to serve to keep us enslaved. So the first thing that we have to do to exceed academia is reject man's law. And then when we, once we do that, we're well equipped to exceed academia, but not before. But then, the other part of it is, it is a tremendous study. It's an eclectic study. You got to get familiar and figure out which are the most important books, and then figure out that the other important books are only books that are dealing with those subjects. So what are the most important books? Well, ancient texts of any source, of course, but Homer, Hesiod, the Bible, and then, mythology in general. These are the most important books. And the other books that are important are books that deal with these subjects. So basically, in order for us to exceed academia, we're going to have to exceed, and reject man's claim to the Most High. And it's a lofty task, but see, that's what you're here to do. You got people running around saying they don't even understand the purpose of life. That's because they haven't started the journey yet. They don't really understand the rigors of the journey. They don't understand the perils of the journey. But if they start, they will quickly learn that we're in big danger. There's a good reason that we need to take care of this.
Yeah, and the comparative.
But like I say,
the comparative studies between the various religions,
that's right.
and various myths. So
right, that's why it's called comparative religion, and that's why it's eclecticism. We have to, like I said, we're not going to unravel the Greek until it's studied in the Egyptian. We're not going to unravel the Norse until it's studied in the Egyptian. Which most people don't understand. Even the Egyptology is a failure. But Wallace Budge's work is still very important because it sets a high standard for the scholarship, and that's where we have to start. We have to contend with that. But anyway, let me try to explain what part of the danger of venerating in annual cycles is that when we go east to west, better said west to east in night sky, and then east to west, there's no axis. So that's why it starts with the poles in a stellar, because that is the axis, and the axe is, as I was saying, the way that the axis is carrying the 5 in the gavel in the middle phase of the stellar cult is preserved in double axe, and that is the contingency for all of it. And the evidence for that is the gavel in the modern courtroom as a symbol of power. So we have to understand the hand represents power. And then we add stone hafted to stick, that's double axe. That's more power. So it's in the implementation that the knowledge is preserved and carried through. But the implementation in that way is a contingency for all of it, especially double axe, because double axe is the primary contingency for double horizon. And it precedes single axe. So when we get to single acts, we have to understand that that's metallurgy. And that means advancements in technology, but typically it denotes primacy in the north. And that means amenta in the north. But as I said, we will not be able to understand amenta in the north until we understand the entirety of the unfoldment into the solar phase, which is amenta in the west. So I understood solar doctrines very well before I tried to begin understanding stellar doctrines, but I didn't fully understand amenta in the north until I wouldn't be able to until I understood westing and amenta in the west. So we have to remember that the Great Pyramid is oriented north and that the north side is always dark and cold, because that's a warning. It's a warning about masculine imbalance in the spiritual physical prospect, that the way they correspond, it's a shift towards masculine prospect. So when we're trying to define the worldview schism, the random worldview being associated with left brain propensities, pure intellect, pure steely intellect, the random worldview like the Big Bang Theory, and then that's indicative or typical of a left brain imbalance. And then with the deterministic worldview associated with the right brain imbalance, intuitive capacities, everything's preordained by God. Both of these ideals omit free will. So we need to understand that the random component is free will, and that the deterministic component is natural law. So only if we can demonstrate that and explain that can we or genuinely understand natural law. This has to be understood, because this is what it's all really about. This is what the ancient psychology is. This is the only way to understand how to observe the effect as a result of the cause. Because the effect in the modern world is slavery, modern slavery. It's covert, and it's more nefarious, insidious than chattel slavery, because it's harder to identify. We need to understand that modern government is very dangerous because there's no accountability. In England, it's important to study the history of the kings and queens of England, because in England is the only country in the world where the monarchy had been overthrown and a republic installed under Oliver Cromwell, and then the republic taken back down, and then the monarchy reinstated. It's very interesting, because they understood that at least with the monarch, we had accountability. But I like what you said in one of your recent shows, that all these ideas for modern government came directly from the Jacobins in the French Revolution, which I would 100% concur with. And I've been trying to figure out a way to say that for a long time. And when I heard you say it, it was just right on the money. And you nailed it. And but we have to understand the danger of this modern government, that there's no accountability, and it's just this endless passing of the buck, and this entrenched oligarchy with this puppet vestigial figurehead taking all the blame. And there's no real accountability. We have to understand that the government is a dead entity, and it has no responsibility. It has no conscience. But we have to understand how dangerous it is when there is no accountability. So, Iran did this, or Israel did that, or the United States did this. Well, who the fuck is that? That's nobody that you can hold accountable or responsible for anything. And, That might be the first time I've ever used the F word, and I'm going to let it slide, because it's making my point. And this is a little bit less formal of a show. So I want to be completely unrestricted on this show. But let me finish my point about venerating annual cycles. When our prospect is annual cycles, it's west to east, it's starting in night sky and then east to west. There's no pole. There's no axis. So the danger is going into gimbal lock, which is where we are now, which is like tumbling through space. We've got nothing to ground to. And this is represented by that horizontal line through the solstices. And that horizontal line, when added to gavel, it yields the 9. So as I said, it's also the 8 because it's the 8 spokes of the ship wheel, but it's the 9 in Ta. So we have to understand the danger of this lateral in the gavel. And it's in the Ru, which is the Roman symbol, the Chi-Ru, which looks like the letter P at the top of the gavel, which I would tell you is the source of the symbol of the fasci. What it really means is primacy in the north. And because the Ru is fish mouth, it forms the letter P. But typically that is fish mouth. So Sebek is preserved in that symbol. It's just that in the beginning of classical history, nobody really understands it. The Greeks never understood the Egyptians, and the Romans certainly didn't. But their main modus operandi was to obliterate anything that predated their doctrine. So that's one thing we have to understand, is that this modern solar cult has an unprecedented zeal and fervor to obliterate anything that predates it, because its doctrine is its claim to the Most High. So in that way, we're in tremendous danger, because we've never seen this. Is unprecedented in human history. So it's just important to understand that venerating in annual cycles is a danger, because there is no axis. And that's the potential is gimbal lock, and that is what we're currently experiencing. It's confusion. So I've covered a lot of these points that I was hoping to make, but we still got a lot more to cover. And I'm kind of just going to read over what I was talking about. Yeah, we want to understand that modern science is empirical. So what is empiricism? It's basically the idea that in order for something to be objectively true, there has to be an object. And I want to mention, what is actually sacred and why. Well, that's largely misunderstood. It's only sacred as if it refers us back to pure forms. It's only sacred if it's preserving knowledge. Okay, it's not sacred because it has some mystical power. It's sacred because it's a pure form that refers us back to pure forms and source of knowledge. It refers us back to the original source of the unfoldment. So one of the other things I wanted to mention is that the hand is power, and that's 5. And both hands is 10. When we add axe, that's more power. We have stone on the stick, that's double axe. It's more power. That's why that is the symbol of the final verdict in modern courtroom, because it's the Most High in the sense of it's the final verdict with the power. But the Aten is typifying at 10, and that means full power, and that's represented by the danger of modern technology. So a lot of what's happening is a contingency for man having unbridled control of full power in the modern world with the claim most high. It's very difficult to understand. Yeah, but let me make this point about the cardinal points. So the Christian cross is a divining rod. It's a scientific implement. And it has the vertical line with the horizontal line and the extended lower stem, which means primacy in the north. If you put it upside down, then it means primacy in the south. But it's a scientific implement for orientation. As I said, the X comes first, which typifies. So the Christian cross typifies the cardinal points, and cardinal means opener. But the cardinal points are north, south, east, and west, which is where we get the term news. And Nate was doing a great job breaking that down in his newest podcast, 83, on the cubbyhole. But this is of critical concern because these cardinal points are a solar cult overlap. Because the X comes first, and the X is the contingency for the modern cross. So the X deals with the sabbats, which are the semi-cardinal points. So we have to understand those come first and why. Because number one, they're preserving the five, which is pure animism with the gods of the four corners and the dot at the center. But that these cardinal points, they correspond to a material prospect. And they're overlapping. They're laying on top of the X. The X is underneath as a means of as contingency for these cardinal points and this material prospect. It's very hard to say. But when we look at the Christian cross, the first thing we should identify is these are the cardinal points of the modern zodiac. But they're also north, south, east, and west, or north, east, west, and south, which is news. And there's good news and bad news. The good news is we can understand this and get ourselves out of this mess. But the bad news is we're currently in it. And so just the main thing I'm trying to say is it's the Union Jack. But this is also preserved in the bird's eye view of the pyramid. And this is the ship's wheel, which is our navigation. So it's our orientation. So we always need to remember that the ancient mariners navigated by the stars. And at that point, then we start to remember that the North Star was of the utmost importance. It amazes me how much sometimes that's overlooked, but I'm certainly not surprised by it. But we have to deal with it ideally. So the revelations, as you were saying earlier, it's not prophetic. It's just understanding that we're on a trajectory. And it's always going to look the same. You know, we're going to be fed lies and we're going to be destroyed by the deception of man's law, of man's authority. And man will set up shop and reign for a given period of time, which we can call the devil reigning on earth. It's always going to look and smell and sound the same, but we're, in our ignorance, we're not going to recognize it. We're not carrying the spiritual armor to protect ourselves against it because we don't have truth in hand. So we have to understand that which is most important. What are our principles? So I'm going a little bit all over the place, but that's okay because I think we made some very hard points. And, I think we're getting near the end. But go ahead and chime in on some of this, and we'll see what else we can hash out in this. And if we can take it any further today.
Yeah, no, I think it's important to, yeah, as you said, understanding this is important also for understanding. I mean, understanding natural law is sort of the basics. So it is understanding the basics, but then to understand its importance and why it is important and why truth is of the utmost importance, then we need to get into this more advanced material. So
Okay, I do have a few more subjects I can open up. In Masonry, there's a thing called the LAB, which Nate Cap has really fully demonstrated on the cubbyhole. And the LAB concerns the designation of our time. So the idea of the LAB is 8 hours in the day for occupation, 8 hours in the day for recreation and rest, and 8 hours devoted to the great work or great labor. Because that's what LAB is. It's the labor of unfolding the mystery. The labor of the unfoldment is what the LAB is concerning. So, and this is even, you can, once you really understand this, you can see that in the municipality, in the law of labor laws, that they do understand how sacred this is. That's why anything over a 40-hour week is based on a 5-day work week, 8 hours a day is considered overtime, because they know they're in violation of the LAB. You need to really let that sink in. So as I said, the LAB is 8 hours for rest and recreation, 8 hours for occupation, and 8 hours to devotion to the one great work, which hypothetically amounts to 1/3 of your life devoted to the work. That ought to help explain why most people don't get it. Because how many of those people have actually devoted that much of their life to the work? And the more you do this work, the more you're going to answer those kinds of questions. Why people don't get it. Because they don't give a shit. You know, they want to learn the hard way, and they're going to wish they hadn't. They're going to pray for death, and death will be fleeting. It's going to get that bad. So you better keep that in mind, because this is a serious matter. I can't put enough emphasis on it, and my ambition is not to scare people, but you know what? Whatever it takes, get it done. And, Nathan did such a great job dealing with the subject. I'm not about to really start that unfoldment now, but, I want to refer you to the cubbyhole.com, and Nate will bring you up to speed. And, we're all appreciative of his efforts as of late. And, he's never stopped trying, but his work's only gotten better and better and better. And I'm, at this point, I'm just blown away by the whole endeavor and very grateful to be a part of it. But one other thing I could mention is there's a couple other things I can mention here. These terms, let's just talk a little bit about these terms. Any term that is hypothetically a claim to the Most High. Okay? And I'll just start throwing out a few examples. Okay? These are all in terms of a claim to the Most High. Okay? Jesus, doctor, scientist, king, emperor, boss, Lord, architect. These are all claims to the Most High, potentially. So until we learn to give all the glory to the Creator, it's potentially dangerous. Remember, as I said, in the ancient world, the word king became anathema because it implied theocratic, non-secular monarchy. But at the same time, then we have the King of Kings. So, and then we have divine right of kings. You know, the idea that a bloodline denotes claim most high, or implies or inherently grants claim most high. But Jew is one of the most important ones. So the term Jew is largely misunderstood. What it actually means is Israelite. And Israelite actually means all three phases of the Egyptian mythology. It means the entire unfoldment. Isis is lunar, Ra is solar, and El is the original stellar. So the term Israel actually means the entire unfoldment. And that's what the one great labor is that entire unfoldment. So it's the entirety of the unfoldment of the beginning of the hero cult and stellar to the pinnacle of the hero cult in the solar phase in the perfected eschatology in the cult of Osiris, which we're talking a period of time of at least a couple 100,000, 300,000 years. But I just want to make that a very candid statement. So the term Jew is not an ethnicity. It's a religio ethnicity in a modern institutionalized religion. And we need to understand that it's claimed the Most High. This idea of God's chosen people is really supposed to be those who chose God. And so what the term Jew implies is the Enlightenment. So we have to understand, well, what is all this ambiguity about the Enlightenment? The idea of awakening, this Satori awakening, or you're just going to reach a certain age and you're going to roll over and get this download from the mothership. And then all of a sudden you're going to wake up, or somebody's going to be screaming in your face, wake up, and that's going to wake you up. What a freaking laughing joke. You know, you don't wear clown shoes, you are clown shoes. The enlightenment has to be earned and attained to. And as a species, why would you think that anything else would satisfy us with our mental capacity? We all have the capacity to understand these things. But will we understand them? You know, if I claim to be a wise man, it surely means I don't know. So what actually confers the crown of illumination? What actually confers? Because see, modern masonry with the 33 degrees of the Scottish Rite, we need to understand that's conventional, which means it's already corrupted potentially in the sense of complex forms. It means that the forms will become so complex and they'll continue to unfold into more complex forms when we already don't understand the complex forms that we're dealing with. This is how we end up with the story about a man crawling out of his box and having dinner with his folks. Need to understand what confers the crown of illumination, and the answer to that question is knowing Horus in all of his forms, in all of his manifestations. Because it's not Horus is this, one particular deity or entity. It's an expression of elemental powers. But it's Horus in all of his manifestations, in all of his forms. That's what confers the crown of illumination, because that's the only way we can contend with the ensuing dogma that's a result of the changing types as this unfolds. And that's the best I'm going to say it, and it should be enough to be able to understand it. But that's what confers the crown of illumination, and nothing less than that. So one more thing I can mention is about this cult of Mary. First of all, we need to understand that this happened in posterior to the height of the papacy, which happens about the 11th century. It's at the end of the Dark Age. And it's basically initiated under Edward III when he invades Calais. And they've captured the burghers, and they're getting ready to execute the 6 burghers. And his wife, Philippe, I think, pleads for his mercy. And how this translates into the pleading to the king, or the pleading to the authority for mercy, is translated, and then the feminine is brought back into the Christian doctrines. We need to understand that the feminine was restricted in the Christian doctrines up into this time. And this is part of what leads up to the Reformation and Protestantism. But we need to understand that this idea of this mercy and this cult of Mary arising out of that is a result of this phenomenon under Edward III in Calais, and this is in the 13th century. But it's in the wake of the height of the papacy, which is 11th century. So it's the end of the Dark Age. So everything at the end of the Dark Age is hypothetically leading up to the Renaissance. The Reformation. So what ultimately is the resistance to the orthodoxy of the Roman Church ultimately becomes a means for the Roman Church to spread its wings under the Holy Roman Empire. So that's part of what I'm trying to say. But this cult of Mary is a real phenomenon, and it's interesting, but it's a big subject. But it is about trying to introduce the feminine back into what was strictly a masculine doctrine under the Roman Latin Christendom. So anyway, that's a lot. It might be about all I can handle for one day, but go ahead and we'll see what we got left.
Yeah, that's quite a bit. Quite a bit of information there. Yeah, knowing this will make us be able to face, those that wanna be the only star in the day sky. So having all the power and claim to be the Most High. So this is gonna
that's right. We have to
make us understand.
Yeah,
gonna make us understand how all this is playing out, and from where it comes from.
right. The fact that we have the obelisk in St. Peter's Square is the dot in the center of the square in that sense. So that is Osiris. That's a phallus of Osiris. It's pure animism, because the animistic prospect for spirit at the center is based on a fertility prospect. So let me just say that, because that's kind of part of what Nate was getting into his new show. And I mentioned that to him after the fact, and he's already working on it, So obviously it's going to have to be continued to further flesh this out. But I am hoping that this brings some clarity to our earlier work. And I wanted to see how well I could do. As you know, I haven't put any workout for a while, but I wanted to see how well I could do, just kind of off the cuff, get this much material on the table in one time in one place. And, for those with eyes to see and ears to hear, and let the advanced class deal with this, because I think this is what's of the most critical importance. And, I really appreciate you having me back on to have this opportunity. It means a lot to me.
Oh, absolutely. It has been good to be back, and to be back with you to explain some of these topics. And yeah, I hope they can be, the effort can be appreciated, and I definitely appreciated it, you coming back on here, so thanks for that. And yeah, I think we can close for today, and we can end it here, and who knows, maybe, yeah, as you said, maybe we'll come back again to discuss it further. So yeah, thank you, and if you don't have anything else to add, we can see everybody next time.
As I said, I really appreciate the opportunity to come back on, and cubbyhole.com is where you can find my work, most of my work, and Nate, Cap, and Brandon Martin have their work there, and from there you can find all the other resources that you need. But yes, thanks for listening, and I hope everybody can take this information with great care. It's always an appeal for better minds that can and want to take it farther. So again, we'll see you all in the future, and thank you for listening.
Right. Bye, everyone.